A central lesson of Rhodesia is that there is no escape. They're always going to come for you. Rhodesia is like the size of Texas. It exists landlocked in the middle of Africa, and there was nothing there beyond a few ruins and like some cattle and a few people that managed the cattle before 1890. Just nothing existed. And so they built this civilization out of whole cloth. It's this tiny place with not that many people. It's landlocked. It produces tobacco and grain and a little bit of like cobalt and gold. You know, why did it matter? You'd think that we could just leave them be since very few people in the country were causing any trouble. But no, it had to be destroyed. Rhodesia delenda est. Its way of being was unacceptable to the regime as a whole. So if your goal for dealing with things in America is to move to Montana or move to the woods and just hope the problems pass you on by, you know, your life might be better for 10 more years than it would be if you stuck around in Detroit or Atlanta or wherever, but they're always going to come for you. If you exist outside of this state of believing in total equality, that's unacceptable, and it will be treated as such. There's no retreat, there's no escape. You either have to win or they will. Bitcoin is very good, and it largely allows you to escape both the problem of inflation and the problem of like capital controls, essentially. Like if the Rhodesians had Bitcoin, not only would they have had a better time being able to import things without struggling to make foreign exchange transactions, but also once Mugabe took over, they could have just left, which would have been nice.
I think what disconnects us from people from the old world is they had a lot of things worth dying for, which I think people today need more things worth dying for.
That still exists. People just don't care about it in the way they once did because they don't think it's going to be passed down. There's too much instability in life that makes them not really care or not earn enough. So instead, you just get paperbacks made out of acidic paper that'll fall apart in a couple of years, and you know, just spend the money now because they'll be more expensive later.
You're listening to the Great Reassessment Podcast.
Are you stacking Bitcoin but still no friends? It's time to download Club Orange, the home base for true Bitcoiners. With Club Orange, you can ditch the noise, the lonely doom scrolling, and join a real in-person community built for people who actually get it. You can enjoy time spent with local Bitcoiners who believe in the same sound money principles as you do. I've been using it for almost 2 years. I've been able to attend over 24 local meetups, and I've created lifelong friendships. Download Club Orange today and get connected. Are you tired of eating fiat food? Get your beef and pork today from Acme Acres in Spirit Lake, Idaho, where every cow is grass-fed, vaccine-free, and raised the way nature intended. My buddy Jason Hanley, he runs the place, and yeah, they even accept Bitcoin. Guys, I eat this meat, I feed it to my kids. It's amazing. You gotta try it. It's pure beef, no nonsense, shipped nationwide. Visit acmeacres.us today and taste what sound money should taste like. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Great Reassessment Podcast. I just want to inform everybody that this is the last podcast of 2025. I want to thank everybody who's been tuning in so far this year. It really has been an incredible journey. This is episode 43, and cannot wait to see what 2026 brings along. As my final guest of 2025, I'm really excited because this is a person who I think really can blend two things that we talk about a lot on this podcast, which is history and money. And I am so excited to welcome Will Tanner to the podcast. Will Tanner, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yes. Will, you talk a lot about the country of Rhodesia, and I first heard you on the King's Hall podcast, and that's where I first heard your name, followed you on Twitter, listened to a couple of your episodes so far. You host your own podcast called The Old World. And so can you tell us just a little bit more about yourself and what you do?
Yeah. So when I was in law school, I started a digital marketing company with some guys I met online. And one of the things for that was building out a Twitter account. And so once I was done with law school, I realized that I had so much more time on my hands to actually do things. And one subject about which I'd been reading just out of personal interest was the country of Rhodesia and what happened to it. And I realized that there was this flaw in our understanding of the Cold War, where many people see it as this global fight against communism, which is largely untrue if you look at what happened. Yes, we were occasionally at war with the communists, and yes, we both had nuclear arsenals pointed at each other. But if you look at what happened in, say, Indochina, or in all of Africa, or in most of Asia, or in Europe itself, it really wasn't so much that we were fighting the global left as that we were trying to extirpate any trace of the old world with its focus on hierarchy and glory and civilizational attainment rather than just the production of as much biomass as possible and total equality. When you look at things through that lens, there's the Suez Crisis and the Indochina conflict where the CIA was backing communist rebels as they blew up Frenchmen up until they kind of had to stop that because of the Korean War. The last real struggle in this fight is Rhodesia. South Africa lasted, but it was somewhat different because South Africa could stand on its own a bit better and had a somewhat different culture rather than a colonial culture. Whereas Rhodesia, it was known as more British than the British. It was this true stand of European civilization in what had been a Stone Age, just almost unsettled patch of territory. And it was standing up for what it thought was right, which was European civilization, which was doing glorious things, which was building something exceptional. And so that drew me to the story. I wanted to start talking about it, which is how I got more popular on Twitter and why I've been talking about Rhodesia on a bunch of podcasts, because it's an exceptional story. And I think it's a useful lens through which we can view not only the Cold War, but also what's happening in America and the West today.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. I am going to reveal my ignorance here because before any of this, I had no idea what Rhodesia was or that it. So can you explain what is Rhodesia? Just very, from a 50,000 foot view.
Yeah. So when you look at British colonial efforts, there are these different periods of achievement in doing things. They, of course, lost America with our revolution and then turned their sights towards India, really. That's where Lord Wellington made his name before fighting Napoleon. And they gained all those territories in the Caribbean. And then comes Africa, which is really particularly useful once they have anti-malarial drugs and once they find a huge amount of gold and diamonds in South Africa. And one of the leaders of this quest to not just send a few trading outposts or military bases to Africa, but to actually colonize it and settle it was Cecil Rhodes, who's this famous Titan. There's the great picture of him standing with his legs going across Africa. And one of his dreams was building this Cape to Cairo railway. He thought it'd be cool to unite the continent with a railway, emblematic symbol of the Victorian age that could go all the way from South Africa to Egypt, both of which were British possessions because of various wars. Of course, there were the later Boer Wars that led to British expansion into Boer settlements somewhat to the north of the Cape, but they had conquered the Cape itself, in the fight against Napoleon. And so he wanted to do this and wanted to expand. And that was given an additional impetus by the Rand mines, which, if you've ever bought a Kruger Rand, that South Africa is incredibly rich in gold and in diamonds. And so they were thinking, well, we might find these minerals to the north. There's not really anyone there because the Zulus and the other tribes have killed so many people and they've been fighting and it's been stuck essentially in the Stone Age. So there's this essentially virgin territory that could be incredibly rich in minerals, and settling it will give us this ability to unite the continent with a railway, because this is really the missing patch. It turned out the Congo was harder to get through than they thought, so the railway was never really quite completed, but they got kind of close. In any case, Rhodes forms the pioneer column to go settle Rhodesia. And this is an important point to make, though it's somewhat in the nitty-gritty, because most colonial ventures at the beginning you think of as the freebooter types, whether they're privateers or need to escape England because of some debts or stuff like that. You think of those sorts of people and they're fun. But the pioneer column was different in that Rhodes excluded that sort of person. He was looking for people of all social classes, from the aristocracy to just the working class, but people who were more educated than normal, who were of good moral character, and who could actually do things other than just try and push the natives into slavery, essentially. So it was a different group. It was a better educated group, somewhat brighter, more interested in actually doing things. And he sends them north into what became Rhodesia to settle it. They strike some deals with the natives. There is a native uprising they have to put down a few years in. They're tangentially involved in the Second Anglo-Boer War. But really, Rhodesia just forms because there's not many people there, and because they find that though the minerals are somewhat lacking compared to what they expected, it's incredibly rich farmland. And so the British start settling it as a farming colony. It becomes known for tobacco and later on wheat as well, which is important because you're talking about economics and money earlier. If you look at Britain in the same period, which is really essentially 1900-ish until after World War II, the trend in Britain is towards extortionate taxation, huge incremental taxes on land values, huge income taxes, and particularly severe estate taxes, which was a problem in Britain because so much of the country's power and culture is tied up in these large landed estates, like you think of with hunting in Britain or the British aristocracy. So a lot of that sort of person was looking to get their money out of the country and put it in something that they could recognize, which is farming, but in a place that was not hostile to their existence. Which is what Rhodesia becomes, where you have the second Duke of Westminster, who's one of these last, dukes or dukes types. He invented the armored car and was a war hero, and he helped settle Rhodesia with cotton and tobacco plantations. Similarly, the Duke of Abercorn and a bunch of these types, in any case, unite in this venture to settle Rhodesia. And so Rhodesia starts off really like at this point, like the 1910s, the 1920s, somewhat differently in that it's attracting all this capital from people who are somewhat like the pioneer column, better educated, have larger capital behind them, and are interested in actually doing things. Whereas Kenya to the north is different in that, like, the British dissipated elite goes there to drink their worries away. There are all these stories of just utter debauchery in Kenya that kind of funny, but it's a different place. Rhodesia was a somewhat more serious country. It had much more going for it in terms of creating something. And this makes it incredibly successful because it has all these natural advantages. The rich, fertile soil, much of the country isn't afflicted with the various blights that like wipe out cattle in other parts of Africa. It doesn't have access to a port because it's landlocked, but it does have good relations with the Portuguese in Mozambique and with the South Africans. So it has really good trade networks. And it just becomes this incredibly successful colony with a very cool English culture in that it's like with the pioneer column. It's the best of the best rather than just anyone. And that was reflected in their immigration policy where they only let in people who would integrate with Rhodesia's very unique culture. So it just becomes, by the 1950s, this hugely successful agricultural colony that also has budding industry, has relatively successful mines. There's a vast amount of capital that has poured into the country and made these farms really modern and up to date. And there are, at that point, say 200,000 white settlers, along with a few million Africans, who they were just a little bit different. They were more English than the English, more British than the British. They were known for being relatively educated. It was probably one of the highest IQ Anglosphere countries to have existed on average, if you look at some of the studies of the intelligence of the people there. And so it's a place out of time. Which is a problem for it in the 50s, because at that point, the British want to shed their colonies and be done with it all and revert to egalitarianism. And Rhodesia stands against the tide, and instead of just giving it up, says, no, we're going to fight this. So that's where Rhodesia's struggle becomes known, where if you see pictures or videos of Rhodesia on Twitter, it's almost always the guys in short shorts or the guys in brushstroke fighting communists in either the jungle or the plains. And that was Rhodesia for the next 15 years, from 1965 until 1980. The country unilaterally declared independence with a Declaration of Independence that was very similar to the American one, and intentionally so. Essentially, the whole world turned against them because the Western countries, NATO essentially, with the exception of Portugal and South Africa, had, you're defending hierarchy and that's racist. And despite the fact that Rhodesia had no apartheid system, which I should note, it was characterized by generally good relations between the white and black Rhodesians. But they said this is racist because you have a non-democratic voting system. They had landed or propertied voting where you had to have a certain level of educational attainment and property to vote generally. And so Rhodesia was fighting for that and fought this 15-year war to try and stand up to the tide of egalitarianism. And both the communists and the Western countries funded and aided its enemies as it did so, which is why it's kind of the culmination of this titanic conflict between old world values and the various forms of egalitarianism that have shaped them.
What type of a man was Cecil Rhodes? Like, was he a Christian? Was he... I heard you talking about one other podcast that he was sounded like he was a great negotiator by the way he sort of settled these deals with tribal leaders before the country began. Like, talk to me about him a little bit as a man.
Yeah, he's one I should read more about. But from what I understand, he was a Christian, and he was kind of like a paragon of the Victorian age, or a summation of its qualities. He's always looking for investment opportunities is probably the wrong word, but ways to expand the empire and do so in a way that made sense with the spirit of the time, which was this commercial growth, essentially. Like the railways, the ports, the mines. There was more to them than just the money, but he was this sort of person who made the empire work. And I think that really represents who he was.
And what were his relationships like with some of the indigenous leaders that were there?
Yeah, so if you look at how he managed things, I think he was based primarily in South Africa for this rather than he didn't live in Rhodesia. But his the way they made it work was they formed the Rhodesia Company, which was somewhat like the Virginia Company in that it was a private colonialism venture. And so he attracted capital from the sorts of people I mentioned earlier, and they set out to make settlement and colonization happen. Is part of that, the Ndebele is the main, or was at the time, the primary tribe in Rhodesia, which comes back to bite later because the other tribe is the Shona, of which Mugabe was a part. But anyway, the Rhodesia Company strikes these deals with the Ndebele chieftains who essentially ruled over the territory. Particularly, there's one king whose name I forget, to allow Rhodesian agricultural and mineral exploitation settlement to occur. That more or less worked, and the Rhodesians, as part of that, were providing arms to the Ndebele army or armed forces, which were very informal, to help them in their oppression of the Shona. But that explodes in this war in the late 1890s because many of the natives saw that their country was being colonized because the British were far better farmers than they and much better about making that actually work and then bringing in more settlers to continue it. So you get the same sort of fights you do with, King Philip's War in Massachusetts or the Indian attacks on Virginia settlement in the 1620s and 30s. And it plays out more or less the same way, where there's this initial period of, oh no, we're under attack, we might die. And then, well, we have repeating rifles, so we beat you. We have the Maxim gun and they do not, as was said of a battle to the north in Omdurman. But anyway, that ends pretty quickly after a couple of years, I think. And from that point on, the relations were much better because, again, there wasn't this apartheid system. The Rhodesians were pretty good about leaving the tribal villages to their own devices and letting them self-rule as they wanted. And so though there's this expanding tide of white settlement, the Africans living there could more or less live as they pleased or come into Rhodesian society as a agricultural worker, nanny, or positions like that, in which their living conditions were much better than they had been. So after the relatively short revolt, the settlement is characterized by good relations between the Rhodesians and the natives on the whole, and much more so than in, say, South Africa.
Mm-hmm. And so today, Rhodesia is the country of Zimbabwe. Is that right to say?
Yeah. One distinction to be made is that it used to be northern and southern Rhodesia, and northern Rhodesia became Zambia in the 1950s and 60s. And it never had more than a few thousand white settlers and was also just somewhat different because there was much more mineral exploitation there because of this copper belt. So it became African ruled earlier on and without a civil war. And though the initial dictator was terrible, they didn't have the same expropriation thing in quite the same way Rhodesia did. So that's northern Rhodesia. And then southern Rhodesia is the country that became the Republic of Rhodesia. And then from there, Zimbabwe.
Okay. So yeah. Because there's a lot of questions I have. But Rhodesia's money, let's get into the type of money that they had. I did a little bit of research before. It was called the Rhodesian dollar.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have a central bank system where they were dependent on these other networks globally? I read somewhere that their dollar was pegged to sterling or maybe the British pound. And did they have a relatively stable economy?
Yeah, so it's probably best to start at the beginning of the settlement and get into what changed. So for most of Rhodesia's early existence, you still had the actual gold standard. So before World War I, there's the famous line from A.J.P. Taylor, someone like him, where you could leave London with a bag of sovereigns, which are the quarter ounce, essentially gold coins the British used, in your pocket, make your way to Argentina, and then make your way to China, and then make your way to South Africa and back to London. And everyone used gold, so you're fine. And that was the case where not only was this area rich in gold, but there was a global gold standard, essentially, with kind of the exception of China. So, that's just what they used for currency. And and then so that continues. And of course, the gold standard is weakened in the ensuing decades. But Rhodesia was still part of the British Commonwealth and was a relatively integrated part of it. So like Canada and Australia are somewhat different in that after the carnage of World War I, they were trying to distance themselves somewhat from the home islands. Rhodesia didn't really have that problem, and so didn't, so it was much closer to the British sterling system. It's also at this point in a federation with Nyasaland and what became Zambia, so there's this block of countries that's working pretty closely in the British Commonwealth and just using the currency associated with that. That, of course, breaks down when the war starts because they declare independence and say, we're not doing this anymore, so they're not using the pound sterling at that point, or a colonial variant of it. However, they wanted their currency to be stable. They didn't want just out of control hyperinflation, which we'll probably get to in a minute. Rhodesian dollar, as you mentioned, was pegged to the pound sterling. The pound sterling during that time was suffering from extreme inflationary pressures. I think the mid-70s is around the time that George Soros broke the pound. But, in terms of currency, Rhodesia's was relatively stable because it tracked with the pound sterling. So there wasn't hyperinflation. There was just some inflation related to the pound's woes. The economic situation, Rhodesia was always relatively prosperous. As I mentioned earlier, its commercial agriculture exploits were known throughout the world. It became the breadbasket of Africa for that reason. And it also had something of an industrial economy and something of a mining sector, both of which did reasonably well. So it did have this productive, stable economy. The problem for it was that because both the West and the East hated it and wanted to destroy it, there were sanctions passed against it by the UN. And unlike most UN sanctions that are voluntary and just something of like a virtue signal, the Rhodesian sanctions, which were the first the UN passed, were mandatory. I think that started in 1965 and then actually happened in 1968. So Rhodesia was technically forbidden from trading with the world, which was a problem because it had cash crops that it exported, and that's how it earned foreign exchange with which it bought things and imported them, and did the the currency exchange, foreign exchange balancing act that you have to with floating currencies. It couldn't really do that once the embargo happened, though it was benefited by having relatively good relations until 1975 with the South Africans. And up until that point, the Portuguese were still ruled by Salazar, who was a relatively good leader, all things considered, and was trying to keep a hold on Portuguese Mozambique, through which the Rhodesians could export and import things through the port of Beira, which is to the south of Mozambique. That ended once the Portuguese had the Carnation Revolution and then gave it up and turned over Mozambique to the communists. So Rhodesia's economy was increasingly strangled by this embargo and by it having very much a difficulty in exporting its cash crops and importing other things. And you get this interesting situation. Russia now might be semi-comparable, where it can produce generally what it needs. So no one's starving, the medical system functions, it has weapons, but there's not really much variety or much of a surplus in the way that there might be in other economies. And so anyway, to your point, the inflationary pressures, I think, were somewhat lessened by being relatively autarkic other than oil in production of foodstuffs and everything like that, but also is hit with the problem of not being able to export its crops, which is a major economic issue. And that makes the economy somewhat unstable, particularly in the early years of the war. But the CIA does this report in either 70 or 71, where it notes that the Rhodesians had recovered and their economy was growing again and things were much more stable than they had been. So again, kind of like Russia, it gets over it and the inflationary problems are lessened. And at that point, it continues to have problems related to the embargo, but it's not as big a deal as the world thought it would be. I know that was somewhat of a rambling answer.
This is really great. What I want to slowly get to modern day, but how did the revolutionary forces get propped up in Rhodesia? How did that happen?
So it begins, for those who are interested in a very detailed study of this, there's a book called So Far No Further by an author named J.R.T. Wood. If you're only passingly interested, I wouldn't recommend it because it took me forever to get through and it's very dense, but it is good if you're interested in this at the beginning. So what happens is Kenya falls in the 50s to the Mau Maus, who are these horrible rebels. And then a few years after that, and the British just give it up because they want to get rid of their empire at this point. They're bankrupt and having problems. The Congo is to the north of Zambia, which at this point was in a federation with Rhodesia. And despite the horror stories you hear about the Belgians, which are largely just utter lies, the Congo was a relatively prosperous and functional place, had really good infrastructure and hospitals and all that. But it falls to the Simba rebels in the 60s because it almost fell to the Simbas. First, it falls to the post-colonial regime because the UN forced it to, against the wishes of the Belgians and the people living there. Race communism is inflicted upon the Congo, and it's an utter disaster. Just the Simba Rebellion is one of those horror stories of decolonization with how awful it is. And so a bunch of people...
Can I interrupt you really quick? Does that have... This is kind of silly, but does that have anything to do with the word Simba from The Lion King?
No, I don't know.
I don't know. That's just what came to my mind. I was like, is that some African word? You know how Disney always they always work in those subtle sexual innuendos in a lot of their movies. I don't know if maybe that was something that they were trying to some political messaging.
That's a good question. I have no idea. I never really thought of that. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. That's all good. Yeah. But so anyway, that turns the Congo into just this anarchic hellhole, and a bunch of those refugees from it stream south into Zambia. And so that's why the Rhodesians were willing to break away from the British, is they were explicitly saying, we don't want to turn into the Congo. We don't all want to be raped and tortured to death, because that's what happened to the Belgians there. And so Rhodesia wants to break away for that reason. But that also means that there's no stable large country left in Africa, because once the Congo just falls into this pit of anarchy, there's South Africa, which is dealing with a bombing campaign that Mandela started in the 60s. Mozambique and Angola are both in the throes of a civil war, essentially, as the Portuguese fight communist rebels. And then Zambia, when it secedes from the British Empire or is granted independence, all that, it's ruled by essentially a communist dictator. And so Rhodesia kicks out all of its agitators, which this is a point I should make, and this is something of a digression, but most of the Black Rhodesians live in tribal villages of the sort that have been in Africa for time immemorial, at least in this period in history. That was an intentional thing where the Rhodesians said, if you do this, you have self-government, rule yourselves however you want. We don't care. Half the country is set aside for you to do this, essentially, land-wise. And so that works out. And those people generally didn't join the communist rebels until the end stages of the war and were generally happy with Rhodesian government. There were about 300,000 Black Rhodesians who moved to the cities to either work in low-level factory occupations or to work as servants or low-level office work, all that sort of thing. That group was the initial core of the communist revolution because it didn't have representation through the tribal chiefs as most of the Black Rhodesians did. And also, generally, they didn't meet the income or education requirements for voting as many, though not all, of the white Rhodesians did. So they were upset for that reason, and they also were much more able to organize in labor strike type things. And here, because they were gathered in the couple cities, Bulawayo and Salisbury, here communist agitation of the sort that was being broadcast all over the continent. And so there are some initial civil rights type strikes where they try and do that whole routine. But unlike in America, the Rhodesians just said, we're not tolerating this, and broke the back of that. And so at that point, there's not really major fighting, but there was, cop on riot or violence. At that point, the communist cadres just fled to Zambia, where they were essentially given refuge by the dictator there. And so from 1965 until the mid-1970s, 74, 75, most of the communist rebels are based in Zambia and then infiltrating into Rhodesia over that border, which is bad for the Rhodesians in that they can't invade Zambia and conquer it, because that would cause a major crisis in which the UN would probably get militarily involved. But it's good for them in that that portion of their border is relatively small, and so they're much better able to defend it and stop infiltration, and the area of farms that can be hit by those rebels is relatively small. But as I mentioned earlier, the Portuguese are fighting a counter-terrorism campaign in Mozambique, which is much, much more of the border if you look at a map of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia over the same period. And that the Portuguese were terrible at fighting. generally. They were sending conscripts who did a terrible job. And so that was a problem for the Rhodesians, in that if that became a base of communist infiltration, they would have this much larger border to defend. It would expand the border by 2 or 3 times. So they're initially assisting the Portuguese in trying to make that revolution end. When the Carnation Revolution happens and the post-Salazar government falls, the Portuguese give up Mozambique and just hand it over to the communists. And it's like a overnight change where the communists are in charge, and they make their country open to the rebels as Zambia had been. And so from that point forward, you see a split where the Ndebele-aligned rebels under Nkomo, who were backed by the Soviet Union, are generally working out of Zambia. And the Shona-backed rebels, who are generally allied with the Chinese and fighting for Mugabe, are generally working out of Mozambique, though there's a lot of overlap. And that expands the border. So from that point forward, the communist aid is just coming through all of Africa, because most of Africa at that point was taken over by the communists. But the primary bases are Zambia and Mozambique. And the primary sides are Nkomo is aided by the Soviets, and Mugabe is aided by the Chinese and North Koreans. And they're all trying to infiltrate and attack Rhodesia from those external bases of support. And a lot of their fighters came from outside the country rather than inside the country.
That's fascinating. And my mother-in-law, she did a couple of mission trips over in Zimbabwe, and I had heard the name Mugabe for a little while, because he was a dictator for a long time, right?
Yeah, from essentially 1980 until the 2010s.
Wow. My one thought is but why though? What is the end goal? Is it really the communist veneer for, is it a utopia? Is it egalitarianism? What do you think is their end goal in all of that? Why did the Chinese and the Soviet Union, why did they want to fund these revolutionary forces to take over Rhodesia? What did they stand to get out of all of it?
Yeah, so in this period, the Sino-Soviet split had already happened and was escalating, particularly as the war gets into its 1970s stages, which are much more severe than the initial stages. So the Soviets want to have their guys win, and the Chinese want to have their guys win, because Zimbabwe is it's a good country to control. It's it's a key strategic location in southern Africa, because to it is the Congo to the north and South Africa is to the south, and South Africa is this bastion of non-communist living. And so there's that reason where they want to have their guys in charge. There's also the the general spirit of the Cold War was this anti-imperialist attitude, which expressed itself in imperialist sensibilities where everyone wants to control other countries. If a comparison would be Indochina, where everyone hates the French because the French are saying, well, we do a better job ruling than any of you guys ever have, and this place is prosperous, so why wouldn't we just stay? And the communists say, no, you're oppressing people. And America says, no, you're oppressing people because they want to vote. And so you get that. Much the same thing happens in Rhodesia, where the communists say, you are British imperialist stooges, you're racists and evil, and so we're going to destroy you. Meanwhile, America and Britain say, well, your voting system, this A-roll and B-roll system, where to vote in the national elections, you have to meet an income threshold and you have to be educated. That's racist because per capita, it excludes more blacks than whites. So you get the disparate impact thinking in this colonial country that had been stuck in the Stone Age 80 years beforehand. So that's racist, and you need to do away with it and have one man, one vote democracy in Rhodesia. And the Rhodesians said that's unacceptable, because that's exactly how the Congo turned into what it is, and we don't want some tin pot dictator killing all of us. And so that was really the fight. The Western countries were saying you need liberal democracy in Zimbabwe, and the communists were saying, well, we just want to destroy you because you're the opposite of what we represent. So I would frame that as being the egalitarian spirit, but there's also the strategic positioning and resource exploitation matters as well.
So the topic of Zimbabwe comes up in a lot of Bitcoiner circles because of the hyperinflation that they've experienced since 2008.
Mm-hmm.
I think it must be the record for the country that has experienced the most inflation. And so I think I read somewhere that it topped out at somewhere 68 quintillion, sextillion percent. Yeah. They're famous for having the $100 trillion banknotes which if you were to count to 1 trillion in seconds, 30,000 years. And so you'd have to multiply that times 100. So was it 3 million years in seconds? Like, it's just a number that's incomprehensible. So fast forwarding to somewhat contemporary Zimbabwe, what did they do wrong? Like, this new government that they ushered in, how did they blunder it so quickly? And what happened to their economy that led to a $100 trillion banknote?
Yeah, I might start in the 80s if that's okay.
Sure,
and
go
just
for
work
it.
out what happened. Yeah. So in 1979, Rhodesia recognizes that the war is probably unwinnable because they had been counting on Western governments coming to their senses and saying, no, we shouldn't let the communists rule all of Africa. That seems like a bad thing. That was essentially Rhodesian end Krieg state of things. Where that's what they wanted to happen. Then Margaret Thatcher's elected in 1979. Thatcher is terrible and essentially tells them that no, the communists are going to rule you because you're racists. So they're disillusioned with the West and say, well, the war's not winnable. So they keep trying to strike deals at that point. It eventually ends in 1980 when Lord Christopher Soames comes in as the election monitor to make sure the election's going to be fair. And what he does is let Mugabe torture and terrorize people into voting for him. And so that puts Mugabe in charge of the country where he's the dictator, and the West says, this is great. You're going to love freedom. So we're moving forward with you in charge. Mugabe then immediately uses his power and an imported division of North Korean, the best North Koreans that were available, to genocide the Ndebele, who are the perpetual enemies of the Shona, which goes back to the British colonial exploitation and way of ruling. So you have this immediate genocidal war called the Gurukundi, where it's Ndebele and Shona fighting, and Mugabe wins that. So he's in charge of what remains of the black part of the country, and he's also ruling over the whites. But the British remain involved, and they tolerate all that. And the British say, well, we know you want to have more farmland in the hands of blacks than whites, which makes sense because that's what you told your troops you were fighting for. What we don't want is the Congo to repeat, at least immediately. So we're going to backstop this process where as long as you take people to court and win a ruling where you say you're going to control their farm from thenceforth, we'll pay for that. And the British taxpayer will backstop your expropriation campaign where you can pay people and it's not as big a deal. That works out okay for the next decade, essentially, where the white Rhodesians who want to leave can kind of sell their farms and do so, and they don't get a great price, and it's hard to take capital out of the country, but they're not being murdered, and they can just pay and it'll go away, or be paid and go away. And Mugabe is becoming more of a tyrant over this period. Initially, there is still a parliament type body, and some whites are in it, and there's some political bickering, but he increasingly tortures and dispossesses his enemies, and so he's becoming more and more a dictator. But he doesn't want to do the full expropriation thing because this isn't just trite, this is serious. He really likes Savile Row suits and Rolls Royces, and so he wants to keep good enough relations with Britain that he can continue getting luxuries like that, so he goes along with them kind of putting the brakes on him. But that works for about a decade. By the 90s, his troops are furious because life in Zimbabwe had been getting steadily worse for all the reasons you can imagine. And they say, you promised us farms and good living, and instead we're still poor and backward, and this is terrible. So you need to give us something more. So he initially tries to just buy them off, and all the accumulated capital of generations that were still in the Zimbabwean treasury, he just hands to them as checks and says, here's your 50,000 Zimbabwean dollars or whatever it was. It wasn't really that much. Have fun. Here's your payoff for fighting for me. They blow the money immediately, and there's some inflation. So that doesn't go great. And he says, well, I don't want to revolt. I want to stay in power. So what I'm going to do moving forward is just expropriate farms, and we're not going to pay much, if anything at all. And at that point, the British were kind of done with the whole situation. The Cold War is over. They've been paying for this guy's tyranny for a decade and a half. And so they pull the plug on financially backstopping it. And so from the mid-90s to the early 2000s, there's still something of a limit on the expropriation, where the country is not just in complete crisis mode, but it's getting a lot and a lot worse. It finally comes to a head in 2008, where Mugabe, through a Supreme Court ruling, so it has color of law, says, essentially, if the government wants your farm, it's just going to take it and not pay you. And if my former soldiers, these communist terrorist fighters, want your farm, they can just show up and squat on it and take it, essentially. And so that's the state of being in Rhodesia from 2008 until like the mid 2010s, when by 2013, there's not a white-owned farm left in the country. Total expropriation. This didn't really happen to like houses in the cities. So you still get a few whites like Ian Smith, the former prime minister, living in Harare, which is what Salisbury was renamed. But the countryside, just complete expropriation. All the white farming families are wiped away. That's a big problem because those were the people who actually like knew how to farm with tractors and fertilizers and global sales contracts and commodities futures. Mugabe just puts these like terrorist rebels in charge of modern farms. And so that goes terribly. Farming production, like production of tobacco, falls by like 75%. He does the same thing with the mines, and production in those also falls like 60%. The country's just production of things generally falls off a cliff. And because most of the country worked in agriculture, like, as laborers on the tobacco farms or whatever, they're all out of work because these farms no longer function. So unemployment goes up to like 80%. And a big problem for the country, it has huge foreign debts that are either denominated in Zimbabwean dollars, but much more likely in US dollars or British pounds or something of that sort. And so it needs to be able to pay for its debts, and it needs to be able to import things that it now is no longer producing because it has completely destroyed its economy. So it needs to import food, it needs to import medicine, it needs to import anything you can imagine. It can't do that because now it has no foreign exchange because it's not selling anything, because it's not producing anything. So you get to the situation by like the early to late thousands where Zimbabwe is just trying to print as much money as possible to pay its debts and try and import things. But that immediately ends in disaster because there's no trust and faith in the Zimbabwean regime and it's not earning anything. So by the time in like, I think it was around 2012, maybe, or like sometime in that period that inflation hits its peak, not only is it at like 30 sextillion percent or whatever it was, but the money is so valueless that often they couldn't even pay the German printers who were printing the money to print it because by the time it rolled off the printing press, it was so valueless as to not be worth accepting as payment for printing more of it. So that goes how you would expect, and it's just a disaster. And so that's how the hyperinflation comes, because the country, like its whole prosperity and ability to do things had been premised on cash crops and some mineral exports. And essentially all of that goes away with the farm expropriation.
Yeah, so farming just decreased, all the exports, they got nothing to sell, and now they're just printing money like crazy. Which, the printing of money just makes the rest of the money go down in purchasing power. Man, that must be, what do you think it would feel like to live under such a transition like that?
I think it's just inconceivable. Because like Weimar Germany, which I think from what I remember had a similar thing with printing the money when it was trying to get out of the debt obligations. Or at least they had some functional society that existed where you could barter for goods or you could kind of exist. This was different in that everyone who knew how to do anything was gone. They just left. So there's not only no societal like capital, either monetary or physical or human or relational, but there's just there's no one who could do anything. The country like was reverting to the Stone Ages intentionally, which is just insane. So I think it's really hard to imagine.
Yeah. Why do you care about Rhodesia?
Yeah. So one is, I think it makes it easier to examine America's problems through a lens than just outright. Because like here, when you get in the debate over the Civil Rights Act, which is worth debating, but there's a lot more emotion tied up in that and in various things connected to it, whether they be slavery or crime, than there is in saying, well, like, why did we have to destroy grain farms in this landlocked country in Africa? Like, why was that a priority of the State Department and CIA? And I think examining the answer to that question, which is the idea that as the CIA put in their report on why Rhodesia was being fought against, yes, its enemies are communists, but because its society is unequal and hierarchical and not a mass democracy, it must be destroyed. Rhodesia delenda est. And that's paraphrasing, of course. I think that attitude is the attitude behind most of America's decay. If you listen to the song, which is in First Man, which is great not documentary, great movie about the Apollo program. Why were civil rights protesters protesting against the space program? Why were they singing that song "Whitey on the Moon"? Well, it's for the same reason that Rhodesia was destroyed around the same time. It's this idea of civilizational greatness, of building cathedrals, of country manners, of getting to the moon, rather than just pouring every resource into the gaping maw of the welfare state. They see doing that as unacceptable. And that's a broad mindset really across the world, but particularly in areas that have been hit by Western liberal democracy or its propaganda, where there's this just inability to accept that equality is a false god, that people are possessed of different capabilities, and that should be reflected in society. And it needn't be cruel or kind of like pinpricky in the way that the South African system is, where it's always just in your face and it's very rude and harsh. The Rhodesian system wasn't that way. The blacks and whites generally had very good relations, and the society just reflected differences in human capability within everyone. Like, many whites couldn't vote because they couldn't meet the income or education threshold, and the Rhodesians said, we don't want you voting. You need to be able to show that you're a steward in your own life before you can steward the country. And I think that is a very good mindset. That's why America had property landed voting when the Republic was started. That's a very sane way of going about things. Britain had the same system for its period of glory. It really only ended in Britain in like the 1860s. And so anyway, to get to your question, I think it's an interesting way of looking at our decline and the reasons for it, because it lacks many of the emotional responses that are tied up in harsher systems like the South African one, or problems closer to home, like nationalization in Britain in the 90s, or civil rights and the related taxation and regulatory regime in America that has existed since the 60s.
So if you're to look at everything you've studied about Rhodesia and examining the history of Rhodesia, what applications do you think we can, or considering everything you've learned about Rhodesia after studying it, what, if you were to apply that to our current situation in the United States, right? You mentioned the decline of our own country.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we face a similar fate as Rhodesia? Where do you think some of what happened to Rhodesia parallels with what's happening in the United States?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is a central lesson of Rhodesia is that there is no escape. They're always going to come for you. Rhodesia is like the size of Texas in terms of acreage. It exists landlocked in the middle of Africa, and there was nothing there beyond a few ruins and like some cattle and a few people that managed the cattle before 1890. Just nothing existed. And so they built the civilization out of whole cloth. There were never that many people there. There were about 250,000 whites at its apogee and a few million blacks. So it's this tiny place with not that many people. It's landlocked. It produces tobacco and grain and a little bit of like cobalt and gold. Why did it matter? You'd think that we could just leave them be, since very few people in the country were causing any trouble. But no, it had to be destroyed. Rhodesia delenda est. Its way of being was unacceptable to the regime as a whole. So if your goal for dealing with things in America is to move to Montana or move to the woods and just hope the problems pass you on by, your life might be better for 10 more years than it would be if you stuck around in Detroit or Atlanta or wherever. But they're always going to come for you. If you exist outside of this state of believing in total equality, that's unacceptable. And it will be treated as such. There's no retreat. There's no escape. You either have to win or they will. So I think that is an important mindset to remember. Is Rhodesia happening here? I think spiritually it is. Like, if you look at Mamdani's tax plan in New York City, how is he going to pay for free buses and the like? Well, he said he wants to tax white neighborhoods at a much higher percentage rate with property taxes than he wants to tax black neighborhoods, which on one hand is very Zimbabwean. It's just expropriation. However, the distinction is that in the West, largely the threat of violence is implicit rather than explicit. So in those famous pictures of expropriation from Zimbabwe, there's like the family with the babies standing behind this chain link fence with barbed wire on top. They have a Rhodesian ridgeback by their side, and there's this mob with like axes outside the gate. And, that's a very explicit threat of violence. Those people are going to murder you if they get past the gate because they want your farm. So that's how it played out in Zimbabwe. I think the better comparison for how that spirit will happen in America is Britain in the 1950s, where the country manor homes, the coal mines, the steel industry, the Bank of England, the hospitals, all of which had been privately owned up until that point, were nationalized by the state. It just took them. There were never really troops going in to make that happen. It just said, well, they're ours now, and you can try and fight us in the courts if you want, or maybe you have a friend in the palace who can help you out. But generally, these are ours now. And if you manage to keep some of this, like if you kept your farm or if you kept your house, well, that's great. But the death tax is 90% now, and the income tax is 90% now. So we're going to take it. And I think that's probably the more realistic view or lens through which you can look at expropriation in the West, where outside of riots like in 2020, probably there's not this like mob of people who will directly benefit from your demise who are going to show up at your door. But whether it's through pro-squatter regulation and legislation of the sort which exists in most states, as we saw with the illegal alien squatter thing at the beginning of the year, or taxation, which is extortionate, or property taxes, which have been a huge problem in places even like Texas, the state will just take it, or more realistically, make you sell it to someone who is not burdened by the same regulations that you are, where you have to sell your family business, but a foreigner who gets a special SBA loan can buy it up and then just keep passing that around, as we've seen happen to things like gas stations and hotels. So I think that's the more realistic lens for viewing how the expropriation part will happen here. But I think it's important to remember that the impetus is the same. They're doing it because they want to take your property because they think you shouldn't be allowed to have it, which is a mindset that I don't think most Americans just can relate to. We don't feel like we're out in the Serengeti with these like mobs trying to take our farms, but they are. And it's important to remember that. And I think Rhodesia, given how tied up its history is in the Western mindset, like its creation came because of this flowering of civilization that came through the 80s and 1900s. And then its destruction came because all of that crumbled and was replaced by something very different in the 1950s and 60s. Rhodesia's tied up in that, and its story is very representative of the shift in mindset. And so remembering where we are and what the state, what the regime and its allies might want to do is really the central lesson of Rhodesia, much more than any practicalities.
This is a two-part question. How would you define a nation, and what kind of a nation do you want to live in?
Ooh. I think a nation is different than a country in that it is a group of people who are tied by blood, heritage, culture. So a country, can be any, collection of regions that are bound together in a single entity. A nation is a united ethnos that shares cultures, traditions, and is different in that regard. I think in terms of the nation I'd want to live in, it's just what America was or what Rhodesia was. I think a place that allows for the flourishing of humanity or the flourishing of the exceptional within it is very much the sort of place in which I would want to live. So, that's America before the Progressive Age. It's Britain before the Parliament Bill. It's Rhodesia before Mugabe. And what makes that different from just like America as a country is I think America has very strong Anglo roots, as did Rhodesia. There's this very unique spirit that comes with Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman settlement that's different. It's what makes us different from the Germans or the French. It's why we can't really relate as much to their histories as we can to England's and Magna Carta. And so I think that is different. Like, free speech is very much our concept. They've never really had that in Germany. The hostility to central authority is somewhat different. The skepticism of city life is somewhat different. There's so many things it's hard to count or put my finger on, but there are things that make us unique as a civilization and nation, and I think they should be cherished at the same time as we are allowed to flourish, rather than being weighed down by the millstone, the albatross of equality, forced to give every kid in the favela braces before we can go to build a base on the moon.
Mm-hmm. The United States is kind of a complicated place because, I don't know, just my gut and my instinct, I don't know what else you want to call it, is like, what is our people, right? I've never really been able to define that, right? And I think leaders, governments, those who try to steer our culture in a particular way have always tried to keep it somewhat abstract, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every time I meet somebody from the South, I always get a little jealous because I feel like they belong to a people,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you take some random Southerner from Louisiana, sit him next down to some random Southerner from Georgia, they're going to share some type of camaraderie. You might not even really be able to put your finger on it. It's going to be a lot of things. It's going to be the intonation and the way they speak. It's going to be the way their parents raised them. It's going to be their faith. And just me being from the Pacific Northwest, like, I don't feel like there's anybody I can kind of share that with. And I think people have a longing for that type of thing. And in the United States, obviously, having its, if you start measuring it from like Jamestown, right? Largely European. There's a lot of black slaves. Do you think Americans have formed a new people that include whites and blacks as like this? I think Stephen Wolfe used the word American ethnogenesis, like a new people is born. What's your take on all that?
I think it's really hard to view America as one united nation for like the reasons you're getting at. That doesn't mean we can't be a coherent country. Like the benefit of regional distinctions that aren't just destroyed by national legislation and financialism and internal like either weaponized or tax-based migration in particular are important for that reason. Because, the Sun Belt in like Arizona is just always going to be different than like the Rust Belt. Similarly, the Pacific Northwest is just different from the Southeast. Florida is its own thing. The Northeast is its own thing. And our system used to reflect that. Like even after the war between the states, the South was a coherent entity. The North was a coherent entity. I forget what the exact term was, but someone on Twitter jokingly referred to the Midwest as like German space age agriculture, where it's just like endless fields of corn and one guy who's like really autistic about making sure the corn's in a straight line. And, like that's true and it's its own thing. And I wouldn't want to destroy that, even if I wouldn't really want to live where the only thing I can see is corn, as far as I can see. Allowing those regional identities to exist and continue existing is important because those areas effectively are nations, even if they don't have total sovereignty. And so it makes, to me at least, very little sense for like South Carolina to be trying to impose a very Anglophilic view of the world and high culture on California, and like putting Mark Zuckerberg in a tweed suit would just be ridiculous, even if it'd be funny. And, I don't think that means, though I much prefer the South Carolina version, that one has to be better than the other. I do think that them being separate matters because the combination of them just becomes totally incoherent and nonsensical, where you have like Charlotte, North Carolina being taken over by big banks. And so the people who move there are then allowing people to stab each other on trains. It's just insane and shouldn't be happening in that, particularly that region. So anyway, I don't think America's a coherent nation, and I don't think a new people has formed because we still have some regional distinctions left. And I think what forms when you force them all to combine is it's not a people, it's just an economic zone that's internally and externally incoherent and largely devoid of any high culture in particular, which is what sets nations apart. Like, where are the manor homes of the technocratic age? Where are the cathedrals? I don't think they exist, and I think that's a problem because that high culture is what made Europe really distinct, and the different regions of Europe, the different ways it was expressed, very unique. Anyway, I'm rambling, but yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Okay. One thing I talk about on this podcast a lot is Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of Bitcoiners believe in the mission of decentralization, and everything you're describing seems to pair with that really well. Like, things just function better when they're governed on a smaller, decentralized sort of scale. And I don't see why it has to be any different with regions and cultures. And because when something gets too big or too centralized, it becomes somewhat ungovernable.
Mm-hmm.
People who have to use it daily feel distant to it, and that they don't really have any sort of control over it. What do you think of Bitcoin?
Yeah, I'm a fan. I think on one hand, Bitcoin is very good and that it largely allows you to escape both the problem of inflation and the problem of like capital controls. Essentially, it's hard to like exactly what I mean on that. But the problem with the gold standard, particularly after World War I, was the way it was centralized just meant that people could get away with cheating. It's very hard, I think, to actually do that with Bitcoin because the combination of it being public and it being firmly in your possession is a unique thing and very interesting. You can't, so it's much harder at the very least to lie about it. So I think that's good. And so if the Rhodesians had had Bitcoin, not only would they have had a better time being able to import things without struggling to make foreign exchange transactions, but also once Mugabe took over, they could have just left, which would have been nice. The problem, though, is in a lot of the Bitcoin maximalists, I think, are wrong in that even if it is this great asset that's going to continue appreciating at a very rapid clip, the problem with having it as the sole asset is it doesn't produce an income. And that's a problem because the old world was different than our own in that the people who led largely did so in a form of service rather than profit from it. There are, of course, bad people who you can always find and point out the examples of corruption in the court of the King of England or whatever. Members of parliament didn't draw a salary until like 1900. The founding fathers very much wanted the same thing in America because they saw their legacy as being one of service. Most officers and most militaries up until like after World War II didn't really make pay commensurate to what they do because they were there in a position of leadership and service to train them for the mantle that they would inherit when their fathers died. And I think that's a very different world. And it was largely backstopped by these 1,000-year assets that did produce incomes that adjusted for inflation over that time, where the Grosvenor family in England is one I always go back to because they arrived with William in 1066 and still today they're the wealthiest peerage family. And they've maintained a large degree of political power all through that, though the current Duke is somewhat different than many of his ancestors. But they were only able to do that because they didn't constantly have to sell stuff off. And had they been selling an acre here, an acre there, property in London here, property in London there, over those past 1,000 years, it would all be gone by now. And they wouldn't be able to continue doing that. And the same would have played out across the aristocracy, where you wouldn't have been able to have this legacy of guidance and leadership and service that was bound up in the way that they viewed wealth and the way wealth was represented, where if you read like the Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy, he's not valued at the capital value of his estate. No one really seems to have much cared what that was. It was, well, his estate produces £10,000 a year in income, and that allows for this lifestyle. And so anyway, I think that is an important thing. And the problem with Bitcoin is it doesn't produce that. So having some of your assets on a flash drive of sorts where you can just leave is immensely valuable. And that provides not just geographic arbitrage, but also an out option that somewhat binds the state because it doesn't want people doing that. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I don't think the maximalists are correct because that sort of asset cannot be the basis of a high culture because it just won't exist or flourish in such a situation because the people who would be maintaining it are instead just constantly rising and falling as they have to sell it off, and that turmoil creates problems.
I think what Jeff Booth might respond to that, don't want to certainly answer for him, but based on reading a lot of the things that he writes about and talks about, like let's say you did have one money to rule them all and it was just Bitcoin, like there's nothing else. In order to get more of it to feed your family, you would have to produce something. You would have to produce some sort of value. Or you'd have to work tangentially to like help somebody else produce value. And you just have to be competing against other people who are also trying to produce value. And so I think what he says is it would just be this epic battle of the free market, and everybody on the earth would have the capability of working towards producing something. And if you don't, you don't, right? Then you're not going to earn any Bitcoin. But in that world where there's a limited supply, things would naturally get cheaper as technology improves and things become more automated. Like we are stripped a lot of the savings that we should naturally incur because of the innovation of technology, but our purchasing power is also lost at the same time. And so we don't see nearly the amount of savings that we should. But I think that might be what he would say is like, if we just had one money, the way you would earn an income is by producing something. You'd have to convince somebody to give you. And I think that could usher in like an entrepreneurial renaissance where we no longer create cheap things anymore. Like, I look around my house, I actually don't have a lot of things worth passing down, which is kind of sad. I think what disconnects us from people from the old world is they had a lot of things worth dying for, which I think people today need more things worth dying for. And, right, like this microphone, like I didn't have to make this microphone, right? Like I just bought it, right? I'm probably not going to pass it down to my great-great-grandchildren. But like, if we have to make things, each person has to make something. I think it just does something to your psyche where, like, I made this book. I made a handmade book with like leather that I repurposed from this old leather jacket. I got
cool.
really nice paper. I made it all by hand. The monetary value of that, right? Like, I don't know. You'd have to see what somebody's willing to pay for it. But like, it's something I'm keeping in my family. And I'm not sure that I would say I would die for it, but like, this is now something that is really special in our family because we write in it. We write down memories, and like, I want my kids to keep that as like some sort of family heirloom. But imagine if everything you had to do in order to work and feed your kids was like that you had to make something in order to procure some of this money. Like, couldn't you earn an income that way?
Yeah, so the problem with that is that while entrepreneurship is good, often people do a better job with that if they have the idea that it can be passed down to their kids and their grandkids. And so a great example of this is the Ford family. The Vanderbilts kind of followed a similar trajectory, where Henry Ford built Ford from the ground up. He was a great entrepreneur. He created vast more amounts of wealth than were ever in his possession, just because the automobile was so, and the production means he used to create it were just so ground shaking. The company remained in the family's hands for a while, but a problem they found was that the way taxes worked and the way it being an illiquid asset, because it wasn't even publicly traded until the mid-50s, meant that they had to sell a lot of it off or give shares to the Ford Foundation, which quickly grew outside their control because of theories regarding democracy. And so then the family stopped being able to do things as the Ford family. And some of them had like a few $1 million and could kind of waste their lives away. But it was inherently unstable, where after like the second generation, where what had been Henry Ford caring very deeply about Detroit and building beautiful things in Detroit, turning the city into this, what had been not much, into this very functional place that was like the center of the world's auto industry and wasn't just productive, but also quite pretty. Like many of the buildings there were nice and they built things. The same thing happened in Philadelphia, with it being like the first center of capital in the country. The same thing happened with like Carnegie building libraries across America, or the Rockefellers with Rockefeller Center. There was this intention to build things that were beautiful because they would be in the family's hands for a very long time and represent the family's dignity for a very long time. And that wasn't just true of the manor homes of England. It was true of like the corporate headquarters in America of these family companies. That goes away once it isn't going to be passed down. And so if you are looking at, you brought up leather-bound books. Easton Press and Griffin Editions still sell those. They're nice. If you look at like what it cost to buy essentially the same thing in 1900 in terms of like grams of gold, the price is pretty much the same today. The inflation has made it hold steady, but it's around the same. That still exists. People just don't care about it in the way they once did because they don't think it's going to be passed down. There's too much instability in life that makes them not really care or not earn enough. So instead, you just get paperbacks made out of acidic paper that'll fall apart in a couple of years, and just spend the money now because they'll be more expensive later. I think if you want to avoid that, and if you want to have some of the things we miss, which are beautiful public architecture, nice things, people with dignity, particularly like a leading elite that has dignity rather than just being rapacious or grasping. The multi-generational component is important there. And yes, like parents have to raise children worthy of empires. aren't just going to get away with like sending them to the local Catholic school or whatever, which is better than the public school. But if you don't raise them, they're not going to be raised to be worthy of it, which is a problem the Vanderbilts ran into after the second generation. However, if on the other hand, you just have this eternal year zero where everything is always changing, everything you have, if you have an asset, you always have to sell it to profit from it. There's no income that can be derived from it. That lack of stability causes people to not invest in the future in the same way, and particularly not to invest in the symbols of permanence that tend towards being beautiful in the same way and tend towards uplifting the spirit. And I think we are seeing that now. America still has a pretty intact entrepreneurship culture in Silicon Valley, but the very nature of those businesses mean that, yes, you might get your big payday, and if you're prudent, you can retire somewhere and it'll be fine, and your kids will be fine. But the companies aren't going to be around for that long, or such is the expectation. And because of that, you don't really get the same sense of wanting to put their stamp or making their mark or leaving a legacy. And I think that is a big difference, and probably one that's been much to the negative. So yeah, I think that's the rebuttal is, yes, you do want to encourage entrepreneurship, and you want to encourage people to try and rise above, but they're not going to do so in like a pro-social way if they think it'll all just be gone, whether because of expropriation, taxation, or instability in the assets at the root of it.
Well, Tanner, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and, best of luck with all your goals in 2026, and truly thank you. I will put links to your socials and things like that and in your podcast. Is there any projects in 2026 that you're working on?
Yeah, I'm primarily write at the American Tribune Substack, which is just the americantribune.news, and do my Old World podcast. So I'll just be digging into those for the foreseeable future.
Awesome. Well, Merry Christmas, and
Christmas.
thank you so much.
Yep, thanks for having me on.
Thank you.